My husband had been quietly building a small fortune for 37 years without ever telling me a word about it. My son-in-law said, at the dinner table one October evening, "So, Mina, when do you think you'll actually be ready to find your own place?" I set my napkin on the table. I stood up. I said, "Excuse me," and I walked out of the room. The next morning, I called an estate attorney. Within 6 weeks, I made an offer on a house. Not the one my daughter had been vaguely gesturing toward for months. My own house, chosen by me, purchased by me, with a front porch and a garden and a key that answered to no one but me. Hello, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Please like this video and stay all the way to the end, and leave me a comment letting me know what city you're listening from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories reach. My name is Mina, and I was 67 years old the night my son-in-law asked me about my plans. I want to tell you everything from the beginning, because the beginning is what makes sense of all the rest. I was married to Carl for 41 years. We met in Boise when I was 23 at a school district orientation where we were both starting our first year in the classroom. He taught 8th grade American history. I taught 5th grade. He was careful and methodical and private in a way I came to love over 4 decades, even when it occasionally baffled me. He read every fine print clause on every document he signed. He repaired things before they broke. He expressed affection through action rather than words. Through the cup of coffee he left outside the bathroom door, on mornings he knew I'd slept badly, through the way he handled every difficult thing quietly and without making a production of it. We had one daughter, and she is very much her father's child in certain ways, which is part of what made everything that followed so layered and hard to hold. Carl died on a Thursday morning in January, 16 months before the dinner. A cardiac event, which is the clinical way of saying his heart stopped while he was drinking coffee and reading the news at the kitchen table where we had sat together for 30 years. He was there, and then he wasn't. I called 911. The paramedics were kind. It didn't change the outcome. He was 69 years old and had seemed perfectly fine the night before, and I spent the weeks afterward moving through our house, like someone who had forgotten how rooms were supposed to work. My daughter drove up from Portland for the funeral. She stayed 2 weeks, then 3, then 4. She is not naturally demonstrative, but she stayed, and that meant something. When she finally sat across from me at Carl's kitchen table and said, "Mom, I don't think you should be here alone. Come stay with us for a while," I said yes without asking what a while meant. I should have asked, but I was grieving and I was tired and she was my daughter, and yes was the only word I could find. My son-in-law's house in Portland was large and well-furnished, the kind of house that projects competence without being showy about it. My son-in-law ran a general contracting business he'd built from nothing, and he was proud of it in the way men are when they've created something with their own effort, which I genuinely respected. My daughter worked in hospital administration, long hours, the kind of work that follows you home even when you've closed the laptop. They had 2 children, Luca, who was 15 and communicated primarily through headphones and single-word responses, and Addie, who was 12 and had a sharply calibrated opinion about everything, which I found genuinely endearing. I was given the bedroom at the end of the second-floor hallway, past the home office and the linen closet. It had a window that faced the backyard. The closet smelled of cedar. Within my first week, I was asked gently not to rearrange anything in the kitchen because my daughter had a specific system, a reasonable request, and I tried to remember it was reasonable on the days when it felt otherwise. I told myself, in those early months, that it was an adjustment. My daughter and her husband were busy. The children were at the ages when grandmothers exist mostly at the edges of things. The quiet I felt, the sensation of occupying borrowed space, would ease once we all found our rhythm. I cooked when I could. I drove Addie to dance rehearsal twice a week. I helped Luca with history exams in the evenings, which he pretended not to appreciate and clearly did. I kept to my room after 9. What I didn't say out loud was that I missed Carl in a way that had nothing to do with the raw grief of the first weeks. when everything was sharp and people brought casseroles. This was the quieter kind, the missing that settles in after 6 months when the world is moved on and you haven't, not entirely. I missed having someone who knew the whole shape of my life and didn't need it explained. I noticed things the way quiet people do. I noticed I was rarely included in the planning of anything. I was informed, not consulted. I noticed certain topics were handled obliquely, circled without landing. And I noticed, one night in March, that the bedroom down the hall had a door often left partly open, and that voices carry in an old house. I was walking back from the bathroom at 11 o'clock when I heard my daughter's voice, low and precise. I've gone over the numbers twice. Groceries, utilities, the extra car use. It adds up. A pause. My son-in-law, quieter. What do you want me to do? My daughter, I don't know. I'm just saying it adds up. And then his voice quieter still. She doesn't have anywhere else to go. A pause. My daughter, I know that. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Then I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, in the dark. She doesn't have anywhere else to go. That was the frame they had built around me. Not a choice extended out of love, but a situation being managed because I had no alternative. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about Carl and something he had said years ago when a contractor had tried to take advantage of a neighbor's lack of options. He'd said, afterward, over dinner, "People give you exactly as much as they believe you'll accept. The moment they think you're out of alternatives, they stop making an effort." He'd said it without bitterness, just as an observed fact. Carl was good at observed facts. I went to sleep. I filed the conversation. I didn't say anything. The letter arrived in April. It came from a financial planning firm in Boise, addressed to me by name. Carl had managed our finances throughout our marriage. Not controlling, simply organized, the way he was about everything. And there were corners of our financial picture I had never examined closely because I had trusted him and he had never given me reason not to. The letter said I was the beneficiary of an investment account in Carl's name and that I was invited to contact the firm at my convenience. I was alone in the house when I opened it. My daughter was at work, the children were at school. I read the letter twice at the kitchen table, then called the number. The advisor who answered, a patient, clear man I'll call Mr. Okafor, explained that Carl had opened a mutual fund account in 1987, the year after we bought our house in Boise. He had set up automatic contributions from the beginning. He had increased them gradually over the years as our income grew. He had reinvested every dividend without exception. He had never made a withdrawal. The balance was $1.4 million. I asked Mr. Okafor if he would please repeat the number. He did. I thanked him. I told him I would call back to make arrangements. I hung up. I sat at that kitchen table for a very long time, looking out at the backyard where Addie's old swing set stood going slowly to rust in the Portland rain. My hands were folded in front of me. I didn't move for close to an hour. What I felt was not what I would have predicted. Not elation, not immediately. Something more like recognition, the slow arrival of understanding about a person I had believed I knew completely. Carl had watched money disappear in his own parents' home, had seen what that anxiety did to people across a lifetime, and had decided without ceremony or announcement that it would not reach me. He had been building me a floor for 37 years and had never once mentioned it. He had left me resources before I knew I would need them, because Carl always thought in the long scenarios. I sat there until I understood it. Then I did what he would have done. I found an attorney. Ms. Bauer came recommended by the financial planning firm, an estate attorney in Boise, plain-spoken and thorough, who met with me that Friday without making me feel I'd stumbled into something beyond my depth. She explained trusts, asset protection structures, privacy mechanisms available under both Idaho and Oregon law. She answered every question without impatience. She sent me home with a folder of documents and the particular steadiness of someone who has been shown that her options are not what she'd believed them to be. I drove back to Portland that evening and told no one. I kept my routines unchanged. I cooked. I drove Addie to dance. I helped Luca study. From the outside, I was exactly who I had been the week before. But something had settled differently underneath, and I felt it even when nothing showed. The dinner happened 6 weeks later. It was a Wednesday. I had made roasted chicken with potatoes, which my daughter's family liked. Addie was mid-story about something at school. Luca was present at somewhere near 40%. My daughter was eating quickly, the way she does when her mind is still partially at work. And my son-in-law, who had been quiet since coming home, set his fork down and looked at me with the expression of a man who has been holding something back for a long time and has decided tonight is the night. "So, Mina," he said, in the tone people use when they want the delivery to sound casual but the content not to be. 14 months is a while. Do you have a plan at this point? Like, are you thinking about getting your own apartment? The table went quiet. Addie stopped mid-sentence. Luca's fork paused between the plate and his face. My daughter looked at the table. I looked at my son-in-law. He was not a cruel man. I want to be clear about that. He was a tired man who had kept a thought in a locked cabinet for too long and had finally opened the door. He was looking at me the way he looked at a project that had run over schedule. I set my napkin on the table. "Excuse me," I said. I pushed back my chair and walked out of the room. I went out the back door and sat on the porch steps in the October air, and I looked up at the Portland sky. Dense cloud cover, the particular gray of a rain country evening, and I breathed. 67 years old. I had cooked their dinner, and the table had gone quiet, and my daughter had looked at the table and not at me, and I had walked away from a basket of rolls. There were no rolls, but the image is accurate in spirit. I sat out there for close to an hour. When I came back in, the dishes had been done and everyone had gone to their separate rooms. No one knocked on my door. No one came to check on me. The house was quiet in the way that silence can be its own kind of statement. I lay awake past 2 in the morning, and I used those hours without softening anything. I looked at the actual evidence of the past 14 months. The overheard numbers conversation. Question and delivered like a line item on an invoice. My daughter's careful study of the tablecloth while he asked it. The way every person at that table had watched me stand up and leave and had done nothing. Then I thought about $1.4 million, about Ms. Bauer, about Carl's 37 years of quiet accumulation, about what they would do if they knew, and that thought, clear and specific and not unkind, just accurate, moved me from uncertain to decided. I got out of bed and found my notepad. I wrote a short list. At the top, call Ms. Bauer Monday. At the bottom, after several intermediate steps, find a house. I stared at those 2 words for a while, then I circled them. The following weeks, I moved with care. Ms. Bauer helped me establish a trust structure that kept my name off public filings. I worked with a real estate agent named Wendy, who operated in a part of the city well outside my daughter's professional networks and who came with a recommendation from Ms. Bauer's office. I told my daughter I had started seeing a therapist on Tuesday mornings. It was the only outright lie I told during this entire period, and I didn't take it lightly. The third house Wendy showed me was on a street called Halcyon Avenue, in a neighborhood I had driven through once in my first weeks in Portland and noted without knowing why. Older trees, front porches, houses that had held decades of ordinary life and showed it comfortably. 4 bedrooms, a sunroom facing south, a backyard with raised garden beds that had gone untended for a season. You could tell from the structure of them what they had been. You could tell what they could be again. I sat in my car outside that house for 20 minutes after the showing. Then I called Wendy and made an offer. My daughter noticed a change before I had expected her to. She was good at noticing things that mattered to her. It was what made her effective at work and occasionally difficult to be around. And by the end of the 5th week, she had collected enough small signals to know something was different, even without being able to name what. She came to my room on a Sunday morning and knocked, which I registered because I had half expected something less considerate. She stood in the doorway with her coffee and asked, measuring the words, whether I was seeing an attorney. I found a business card in the recycling, she said. Bauer Estate Planning. I turned from my desk. Carl's estate had matters that still needed addressing, I said. I'm handling them. She studied me the way she studied a budget report that wasn't adding up. Do you need help? I thought about what help had looked like in this house for 14 months. I have good people, I said. Everything is being managed appropriately. She nodded and left. She wanted to ask more, and she didn't, and I respected that even as I understood what it cost her. My son-in-law found out about the house through a professional contact, someone in a real estate network who mentioned a cash offer coming in on Halcyon, unusual enough to be noted in conversation. He came to me on a Friday evening, composed and deliberate, and asked in his most reasonable register whether I fully understood what I was doing, whether the people advising me were people I actually knew. He said the family wanted to make sure I was protected. He said it with his hands folded and his voice in careful neutral. I told him I had an estate attorney and a financial advisor, both excellent, and thanked him for his concern. My daughter came to my room later that evening and told me she hadn't asked him to approach me. She sat on the end of the guest bed and said quietly, "Mom, are you angry at us?" Anger is a simpler word than what I actually felt. "I love you," I said. "I have always loved you, and I think we've let some things go unsaid for too long, but not tonight." She nodded. The door closed softly. The closing happened on a Tuesday. I signed the papers in Ms. Bauer's office with a notary and 2 witnesses. Wendy was there. Ms. Bauer shook my hand. It was a plain, professional moment, and it meant more than I can adequately describe. That morning, I sent my daughter a text. "Closing on a house today. I'll share the address once I'm settled. I look forward to having you and the children over." She didn't respond for several hours. When she did, it was 6 words. "I hope you're okay, Mom." "I am," I wrote back, more than I've been in a long time. My closest friend, Yolanda, we'd met in graduate school and had been through everything together since, drove down from Seattle the weekend of the move. She arrived Friday evening, stood in the front doorway of the Halcyon house, looked at me holding my key, and said, "You look like yourself again." It was exactly the right thing to say. She brought a cast-iron skillet as a housewarming gift and made the best cornbread I had eaten in years on my first night in my own kitchen. The movers came Saturday. By afternoon, the boxes were in the rooms where they belonged, and Carl's armchair, kept in storage for 16 months because I could not part with it, was in the corner of the living room by the west window, where it looked as though it had always been. Yolanda and I sat on the porch steps with iced tea while the November light moved through the oak tree in long, clean angles. I exhaled all the way down for the first time since Carl died. The family gathering happened a month later. My daughter called it a chance to reconnect. Her in-laws were visiting. Luca and Addie would be there, and she framed it as an olive branch, a smoothing of things. I said yes, and I called Ms. Bauer the morning before to talk through what I was walking into. The table was full. The meal was warm in the way that constructed warmth is, everything pleasantly arranged. Her mother-in-law Linda was kind and asked me genuine questions about teaching. Addie showed me a project she was working on. Luca sat quietly and observed everything the way he always did. About 40 minutes in, my daughter set down her coffee and said, in the carefully modulated tone of a woman who has rehearsed this, that she wanted to speak honestly, because honest families talk about hard things. She said financial decisions had been made that had surprised everyone. She said her concern was simply that I had all the information I needed to be properly protected. I looked at her, I looked at my son-in-law, I looked at Linda and at the children, and I spoke. I explained, without drama, that Carl had maintained an investment account for 37 years that had accumulated to $1.4 million by the time of his death. That when I became aware of it, I had retained an estate attorney and a financial advisor because a sum of that size warranted professional guidance. That I had used those resources to establish my independence, purchase a home, and structure my affairs in a way that was legal, documented, and carefully considered. The table was completely still. One more thing, I said, and I looked directly at my son-in-law. The night you asked me when I was planning to find my own apartment. I want you to know I heard exactly what you meant by that. You weren't wrong that a clear answer was overdue. You simply didn't know how far along my answer already was. He had nothing to say. My daughter looked at her hands. Linda looked at me with an expression I chose to read as respect. Addie had gone very still. Luca was watching me with his father's careful eyes, taking in everything. I said warm goodbyes, hugged Addie, who held on a beat longer than usual, and gave Luca a squeeze on the shoulder, which he allowed with the particular grace of a teenage boy who has decided something matters. I thanked Linda for the hospitality, and I drove home to Halcyon Avenue. I sat in my car before starting the engine. The thing I expected, the residue of confrontation, the trembling aftermath of having said difficult things in front of people, was not there. What was there instead was something quieter and more solid, like ground after a long rain. My daughter called me 3 days later. We talked for nearly an hour. She apologized specifically, not in the general way that covers everything and explains nothing, but in the particular way that names things. The budget conversation. The way the household had treated my presence as a logistical variable. The night of the dinner, and the fact that she had looked at the table instead of at me. She said she had been telling herself a comfortable story about the arrangement for 14 months and had allowed herself not to look at it honestly. She sounded like Carl when she said that, the same quality of effortful, precise self-reckoning. I know, she said when I told her so. I know I do. We made a plan, dinner the following week, just the two of us at Halcyon. I would cook. She came, and we talked for 3 hours, and it was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. Some walls come down slowly, some come down over a meal between two people who are both willing. We were both willing, which is what mattered most. I planted the garden in spring. My neighbor Herb, a retired geography teacher who turned out to have an encyclopedic knowledge of Pacific Northwest soil, came over one Saturday with seedling starts and spent the morning helping me clear the raised beds and assess the drainage situation. We planted tomatoes, sweet peas, kale, and marigolds along the south border, because Carl had always liked marigolds and I intended to grow them for the rest of my life in every yard I ever had. Yolanda came back in May and declared the sunroom the finest room she had ever sat in, then fell asleep after dinner in Carl's armchair, which I took as the highest possible compliment. Luca started coming on Saturdays in June, ostensibly to help in the garden, though in practice he mostly sat at the kitchen table and ate whatever I had made and asked me questions about Carl. What kind of teacher he'd been, what Boise looked like in the 80s, things Luca was clearly turning over in his own private way. I answered everything. We didn't discuss feelings directly, because he was 15 and because we didn't need to. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that, and eventually it became a fixture we both relied on without talking about why. Addie reorganized my kitchen one afternoon and informed me I had been storing my baking sheets incorrectly my entire life. She wasn't wrong. I told her so, and she was satisfied. People ask me whether I have regrets. Yolanda asks in her particular way. I don't think regret is the most useful question. What I know is this: my daughter loves me, and she was also not seeing me clearly for 14 months. She was seeing a problem she felt responsible for managing. Those two things can both be true, and understanding that is what allowed us to find our way back to each other, rather than simply walking away from the table for good. And Carl, careful, private, meticulous Carl, had spent 37 years making sure that if I ever found myself with nowhere else to turn, the premise would be wrong. He had built me a floor without telling me it was there. He had known in the long-sense scenario way he knew things that I might one day need it. All I had to do was decide to stand on it. That is what stays with me. The money was real and the money mattered. But the decision that changed my life was not made in Ms. Bauer's office. It was made at a dinner table on a Wednesday evening in October when I set my napkin down and stood up and walked out of the room. Everything that followed came from that moment. The floor had been there all along. Walking away was how I found it. If you have been making yourself smaller to fit a space where you were never quite welcome, if you have been telling yourself that this is just how things are, that there is no other way, I want you to hear this. You are not too old. It is not too late. The floor may already be there. You may simply not have looked down to find it yet. What would you have done at that table? I would truly love to know. Leave it in the comments. And please tell me what city you're listening from tonight. And if this story reached you in any way, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you so much for being here with me.